One of the biggest fights of the year goes down in a couple of weeks at UFC 330 with Islam Makhachev defending his welterweight title against Ian Garry. So I'm super excited to be breaking down this matchup, talking about both fighters, their strengths, their weaknesses, their skill sets, talking about their path to victory in this matchup. And then at the end, giving you guys my winner pick, breaking down how I think this fight is going to play out. Would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. But we have to start it off here with the current welterweight champion, Islam Makhachev. He is 5'10 with a 70.5-inch reach, 34 years old, 28-1 pro record, 17-1 in the UFC, riding a 16-fight win streak. And then he is coming off that welterweight title win where he 50-45'd Jack Della Maddalena. Really just a straight up uncompetitive matchup between those two guys. Now, I'm going to start off with the grappling of Islam Makhachev because even though he is very well-rounded, I still think the grappling is his bread and butter. And I do think you can make the case that Islam is the best grappler in the UFC. I think he's well-rounded overall, but I also think his grappling is very well-rounded, where he is very good wrestling. His submission offense is impressive, but he also has that longer 5-round cardio where he can execute a 25-minute grappling fight like we saw against JDM, and even when he faces some resistance, he can still pull away in the later rounds like we saw against Dustin Poirier. He's very diverse in terms of how he's actually getting his opponents to the ground. He really likes operating out of the clinch, using foot sweeps, kind of tripping up the legs of his opponents. He has a variety of different ways to finish his single legs, but then he's also totally capable of shooting a double. He really likes to shoot a double when opponents are pressuring him, uses that momentum against them to take him down. But he's a very different type of wrestler than like a Khabib, who's really just gonna, shoot these low double legs at you. Islam Makhachev, a little bit more upper body, more trips, just a different style, even though obviously they've trained together a ton. And then he's also very good at catching kicks and converting those into takedowns. He's very efficient with his wrestling, averages 3.1 takedowns per 15 minutes, lands those takedowns at a 56% clip, which is a super impressive number. Also very good at racking up control time. You're looking at some of his title wins, 19 minutes of control time against JDM, 10 minutes against Poirier, 8 minutes in the first Volkanovski matchup. He's not one of these guys that's going to really open up and land huge ground and pound. He'll stay active, but in terms of finishing fights on the ground, it's definitely more with his submission offense than with, big shots on the ground. And looking at some of that submission offense, 13 of his 28 pro wins have come by sub. 8 of his 17 UFC wins are by submission. And he does have a pretty deep bag. Just in the UFC, he has wins by Darce, arm triangle, Kimura, rear naked choke, and armbar. I'd say at this point, kind of his signature submission does seem to be the Darce choke. He obviously has a crazy squeeze with it. And he doesn't do like the typical method that you see a lot of people do. It's more of like a shallow Darce where he's grabbing the forearm instead of all the way through to the bicep. But clearly it's effective. Submitted Dustin Poirier, also submitted Renato Moicano. And then in terms of his grappling, he's just not someone who makes a ton of mistakes. He's not going to take, many bad shots. He's not going to take a ton of unnecessary risks in terms of, landing huge shots and overthrowing and losing position. He's also not going to spend a lot of energy on submissions that he doesn't feel like he has a good chance of finishing. Islam's only attempted 13 submissions in the UFC, but he's managed to finish 8 of those. So once again, not someone who's just throwing up a ton of stuff just for the fun of it. Now let's talk about the striking of Islam Makhachev. And I think sometimes his striking can get a little bit overrated, just because I think sometimes people can't fully grasp the concept of like how different fighters have to strike against him with the threat of the grappling. With that being said, I still think he's a very good striker. Southpaw, I think his best weapons are his kicks. Does a really good job of ripping those open stance kicks to the body. We saw it in the Volk matchup where he's going body, 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 landing those. Volk's expecting it to go to the body. He goes up top, finds the big head kick to set up that knockout against Volkanovski. Also has very good front kicks to kind of keep the range. He does a pretty good job of disguising the body kicks from the head kicks, where he's not one of these guys that turns his hips over super early. He'll turn them over later, which can be tougher to kind of differentiate between those two strikes. In close stance matchups, I think he does a really good job of beating up the legs. We saw that most recently against JDM. And then when he does get into the clinch, he has some pretty nasty knees out of there. Looking at his boxing, I think it's fairly basic. A solid left hand, decent jab, fine lead hook. Nothing crazy, but totally serviceable given the rest of his skill set. Looking at his cardio, I think he's clearly battle tested. He has 5-round decision wins against JDM and Alexander Volkanovski. He submitted Dustin Poirier in the 5th round, so still has some of that finishing upside late into the championship rounds. And it's not just 5-rounders where he's faced like little adversity. The Volkanovski fight was back and forth. The Poirier one, a little bit less competitive, but Poirier still had his moments, was certainly in that fight into round 5. And so he has proven, even in some of these, fights that don't go super smoothly for him, he's still, in there being effective in those later rounds. Now, looking at his weaknesses, I don't think there are a ton, but there are a few we can touch on here. I think the first thing I'll point out, and I don't even know if you can qualify this as a weakness, but he's not the same type of shutout wrestler as a guy like Khabib was, where if Khabib wanted to go out there and take you down, pretty much everyone he went up against, in terms of his, title reign and championship opponents, he was able to just ragdoll them. If he wanted them on the ground, he was going to get them on the ground. He was never really forced to have extended periods of striking on the feet. Islam doesn't have that same kind of dominant wrestling where we did see, Volk and Poirier were able to fight certain rounds just primarily on the feet, if not still get, a few minutes of striking in there in between the wrestling. It's a pretty, I guess weak weakness because okay, you're not Khabib, whatever. But I do think there's a little bit of a difference there. And then I think maybe kind of just an uncertain aspect for Islam here in terms of a stylistic matchup. He has not fought someone with the type of frame that Ian Garry has. Islam typically has had the bigger frame against the vast majority of his opponents. Now he's fighting someone who is going to be much taller than him, also with a pretty decent reach advantage. So we'll see how he adjusts to that. And then I also think in terms of the boxing in that dirty boxing range, I think that's where he's probably at his weakest. He's super dangerous in the clinch with the knees, but then more importantly, the threat of the takedown. And then at range, he's super impressive with the kicks. I think once you do get into that hands range is where he has some sort of weaknesses. Now, moving on to Ian Garry here on the other side of this matchup. Like I mentioned, big frame, 6'3", 74.5-inch reach, very young, still only 28 years old, 17-1 pro record, 10-1 in the UFC, coming off of back-to-back decision wins against Belal Muhammad and Carlos Prates. We started off with the grappling for Islam, have to start off with the striking for Ian Garry. He is an orthodox fighter, really effectively uses that rangy frame that he does have. He's going to throw a lot of straight shots, a lot of jabs, use the straight right hand. He's pretty good off the counter with that straight right, whether it's a pull counter, a slide back right hand. You certainly don't want to run into that. He's also going to throw a pretty high volume of open stance kicks. Talked about it with Islam, his kicking game. Ian Garry also going to look to land those kicks to the body, go up top against Islam. And then he does a pretty good job of throwing a jab head kick to kind of get his opponents retreating and get them off of him. Also very capable of throwing knees up the middle, which could be very interesting in this matchup. Something that we haven't seen a ton out of him, but I do think could be interesting in this one, is he used a lot of oblique kicks against Carlos Prates. And Prates and Islam Makhachev, very different stylistic matchups, but I think the utility of those is kind of the same, where Prates wants to pressure you, get in your grill, get in the face of Ian Garry, land his big shots. Islam's going to want to pressure Ian Garry, find the clinch to take him down. But using those oblique kicks, it kind of prevents you from really closing in recklessly. You always are going to be weary of, your knee pretty much getting blown out. And so I do think he should be looking to use those in this matchup against Islam. Ian Gary also just has really good shot selection. He's pretty calculated. It's rare that he's just making like these huge mistakes on the feet. And then kind of interestingly in this matchup, I talked about how Islam, very good on the outside, very good in the clinch, not great in that boxing range. I think Ian Gary's kind of the same. The difference is that he has nowhere near the same threat in the clinch that Islam has, but Ian Gary likes to be all the way out, but he's also kind of fine hanging out in the clinch. Now, these are different matchups against strikers. I don't think he's going to love that in this matchup, but this is more to say that I don't know if Ian Gary is going to be taking advantage of maybe some of the deficiencies that Islam has in his boxing, because I also don't think it's a strength of Ian Gary's. Now let's take a look at the grappling of Ian Gary, because I do think he's made some pretty meaningful improvements, both offensively and defensively in the UFC. I don't think his offensive wrestling is going to be super relevant in this matchup, but I do like to just kind of make a note when we do see guys make these improvements, because I think a lot of fighters, you're coming into the UFC, you're undefeated, you're this very good, successful striker like Ian Gary. I think you see a lot of dudes kind of just accept, all right, I'm a striker, I will continue to work on my defensive grappling, but I'm never going to need to wrestle offensively. And Ian Gary did not take that approach, and I think that was a huge part of him beating Carlos Prates, being able to mix it up. If he was just going to go down with the ship on his striking, I don't think he wins that matchup. And so shout out to Ian Gary for that. But like I said, should not be wrestling offensively, should not be initiating grappling sequences against Islam. But in terms of his takedown defense, it's been pretty solid, especially as of late. Defended all 7 takedowns from Belal Muhammad, defended 8 of 10 takedowns from Shavkat. He does have some pretty good balance when guys get him in the clinch, get a single leg on him. It can look kind of awkward, but he is kind of effective from those positions. He hasn't been super willing to accept bottom position. Actually, attempted a decent number of at least trying to threaten a submission against Shavkat when Shavkat took him down. Looking at his cardio, he's gone 5 rounds 3 times in his career, 1 time in Cage Warriors, 2 times in the UFC, Carlos Prates, Shavkat Rakhmonov. I do think his cardio is a little bit of a concern. Not that he has bad cardio, but it did seem like he faded in those later rounds against Prates. Prates took, I believe, round 4 on 2 out of 3 scorecards, took round 5 on all 3. And then Ian Gary actually did have success in round 5 against Shavkat, but that was kind of a weird matchup. There was a decent number of grappling exchanges, but it wasn't a super high energy expenditure matchup between those two. So I don't really think either guy's cardio was super tested in that one. Looking at Ian Gary's fight IQ, I think he just has a really good understanding of his skill set, what he's good at, where maybe he's a little bit deficient in, and he's going to do his best, to maximize the strengths and minimize some of his weaknesses. I think he typically comes into matchups with very good game planning, and he's just a really difficult guy to go out there and outclass, and someone who always seems to be evolving. I think the Carlos Prates fight is just a really strong example of this, where I actually did pick Ian Gary in that matchup. I think today I probably would pick Prates. He's just looked so dominant, in primarily striking matchups. And I think Prates probably should have won that fight, but Ian Gary had a really good game plan. He was crafty. He's been the one guy who's really been able to have Prates look kind of uncomfortable on the feet. He gave him so many things to think about in that matchup, and it led to him getting a win that has aged super, super well in this division. Now looking at Ian Gary's weaknesses, I think a big weakness for him is his lack of punching power. He has now gone 6 straight fights without landing a knockdown, and that means that he's just lacking these big moments in these matchups, and it's really tough when you're fighting some of the best guys in the world to not be able to have those big moments to potentially find a finish or to stamp around, especially in a matchup against Islam where you have to imagine you're going to get taken down at least a few times here. You need to be able to create margins in your realm on the feet. And even some of the other top guys in this weight class, right? Like a Carlos Prates, he can have those big moments. A Michael Morales, he can have those big moments. Ian Gary just hasn't really proven it against some of the top guys in this division. He also doesn't really dominate in terms of his octagon control, has good footwork, does a decent job of deterring guys from like crashing in on him and closing the distance. But like I talked about earlier, he can be a little bit too accepting of the clinch. He can be too accepting of being on the back foot, and that could certainly be a problem in this matchup against Islam. And then the last weakness I have here, I do think he's just less proven in some of these back and forth 5-round fights. You know, a pace like Islam versus Poirier, Islam versus Volk 1, like we just haven't really seen him in those types of matchups in the UFC. So now let's take a look at how I think these guys each individually can win this matchup. So starting off with Islam's path to victory, I think Islam needs to have some forward pressure. You don't want to be on the back foot letting Ian Garry just kind of pick at you. I think Islam should be looking to kind of crowd the kicker here with Ian Garry. Even though Islam also has great kicks, Ian Garry's going to have the range advantage in this matchup. He's 5 inches taller with, I believe, a 4-inch reach advantage. So that is pretty significant in this matchup. I think Islam should obviously be looking to find the clinch, wear on Ian Garry, try to trip up those long legs on the cage. You don't want to stand and, fight a point for point, striking battle against him. Ian Garry is just too skilled, too good in that type of matchup. I think Islam should also be looking to work the body, whether it's, knees in the clinch, kicks from range. I do think also, just the higher pace this fight takes place at, especially if there's a lot of grappling, I do think Islam's more proven in that type of matchup. On the other side here with Ian Garry, I think he needs to go out and look to control the octagon. He cannot let Islam Makhachev back him up against the cage, make it super easy to, get a hold of him, get his hands on him. I think Ian Garry should be throwing a high volume of body and head kicks. You can land those, have big moments with those strikes, open stance matchup, they're going to be there for him. But he also has the ability to beat up the arms, the power hand of Islam Makhachev with those strikes. I'd like to see some front kicks out of Ian Garry, discourage some of the shots, knees up the middle. I think he should be throwing a lot of these, high upside strikes where you catch a knee to the body or to the head. That could rock Islam. You're throwing some of these body kicks, head kicks. Like these are all things that could completely change the trajectory of this matchup. He cannot be accepting of the clinch. And like I said, he should be looking to stamp rounds. He should not be looking to edge out a few strike advantage on the feet and then get taken down and minimize damage. Like you have to go out there and try to stamp some of these rounds, or it's going to be really tough to beat Islam Makhachev over 5 rounds. So now let's talk about who I think wins this matchup. I think this is such an interesting fight between these two guys. Islam Makhachev already an all-time great, but I still think he's pretty unproven at 170. He has the JDM win, but it's pretty clear at this point JDM is not an elite welterweight. He became champ during kind of a transitional period in the weight class. This is a unique frame matchup here for him against Ian Garry. I think Ian Garry is one of the most underrated fighters in the UFC. I think his personality for a lot of people leaves a lot to be desired. But in terms of his skills, what he shows in the octagon, he's extremely talented. He is very well-rounded. I think he's smart. His one loss was a 48-47 decision against Shavkat, a guy that was, viewed as the boogeyman going into that matchup. And then he has shown, some solid takedown defense. Has he gone up against someone with the grappling caliber of Islam Makhachev? No. But, he's passed for the most part against the competition he's gone up against. I am expecting kind of a back and forth matchup here. I think where I struggle with Ian Garry is just, can he have those big moments? I could kind of see it being, not that it's going to play out the exact same way stylistically, but if you were watching that Dustin Poirier Islam Makhachev fight, you could have convinced yourself that Dustin Poirier could have taken 2 of those first 4 rounds. Now, his rounds were going to be, a much smaller margin than the ones that Islam Makhachev won, but you could have painted the picture that Dustin Poirier could have had a shot to win round 5 and actually win that fight. That's how I'm kind of thinking this one plays out, where Ian Garry's going to be competitive. I think he's going to be in these rounds, but is he going to be able to pull away enough on the feet to overcome the grappling and clinch work. And I do think Islam's going to be able to get this fight to the ground. Like, can he overcome those grappling exchanges on the feet? I'm just not sure, because I do think Islam is going to get his control time in this one. And honestly, the Volkanovski fight, I think, is another good example where Volk had a lot of success in that one. It was super competitive. It was a tough fight. And I think you could make a case that Volk won it. But when you're picking rounds for Volk, it's like, this one's kind of a stretch. Like, this one's kind of a stretch. Could you have given it to him? Sure. But more often than not, like, those types of fights are just not going to go in that direction. So I'm going to take Islam Makhachev to win this one by decision. I'm thinking 49-46, 48-47, somewhere in there. And I think the takeaway from this one is that I think it's going to be a competitive matchup. I think the takeaway is going to be like, Ian Garry looked good. He made it tough on Islam, but Islam was able to win, probably 2 clear rounds, and then was able to edge out, a third or a fourth round in this matchup. So those are my thoughts. I am going with Islam. I think it's super interesting, though. Like I said, Islam getting a legit test here at 170. Ian Garry, he's 28 years old. He should be, improving at a pretty high rate here. I'm super excited for this one. Would also love to hear your thoughts. Let me know who you guys are picking in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and subscribe. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.